Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon to wherever you're coming from. Sorry about the slightly delayed start, but we're well underway now. So hello again and welcome. My name is Melanie Ng, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Toronto, and I'm one of your co-organizers for today.
And I'm Naomi. I'm your second co-organizer, and I just graduated from UBC's Department of History with my master's in history.
And it's our pleasure to welcome you all, panelists and attendees, to our virtual symposium entitled 1923, Race, Empire, and Colonialism Across the Pacific, Settler Colonialism Across the Pacific. This event is sponsored by the University of Toronto Dr. David Chu Program in Asia Pacific Studies and the University of British Columbia's Initiative for Student Teaching and Research in Chinese Canadian Studies, and co-sponsored by China-Canada Focus. And so before we begin, Naomi and I would like to say a big thank you to our co-organizers, Tak Fujitani and Henry Yu, for helping us put together the three wonderful roundtables that we have for you today, as well as to Jennifer Liu and Arba Bardi for all their behind-the-scenes work in setting up Zoom meetings, helping us promote the event, and all the other really difficult administrative logistics that the rest of us struggle with. So thank you to Jennifer and Arba. And finally, many thanks to our panelists who all agreed to speak on their first Saturday of the school term. We really appreciate it. And as a final quick note before we fully get underway in welcoming everyone, because we have such a high caliber of speakers here together, this event will be being recorded for posterity, as well as for those who are interested but who are unable to attend today. And we're going to be making those recordings publicly available, so stay tuned for that.
It's been very rewarding to see this symposium come together with the level of keen interest from such a diverse range of scholars from various fields of study. Though this event first came together to mark the 100th year anniversary of Chinese exclusion in Canada, which occurred on July 1st, we aim to broaden the dialogue across Asian, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Black, and other racialized communities. We further wish to expand the conversation surrounding the centenary of the Exclusion Act away from Canada and the bounds of the nation state towards understanding racial exclusion as a phenomenon that went far beyond one country or one specific community. Fundamental to building solidarities in these spaces begins with respect and understanding. Our intent with this land acknowledgement is to help create that understanding and to think about the land we occupy, its histories, and current circumstances.
I'm joining the Zoom today from the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River, who have inhabited and protected this land before the introduction of settler colonial logics of private property. Today, we proceed in the spirit of solidarity with Indigenous leaders across this province, and particularly in the wake of the recent Greenbelt scandal. As the chief of Alderville First Nation, Taynar Simpson, reminds us, the further privatization attack on the Greenbelt is yet another instance in which this provincial government has ignored their treaty obligations and continues to deny the rights of Indigenous nations to their land. A long history that includes the controversial signing of the Williams Treaties in the very year that we are gathered to discuss, 1923.
And for my part, today I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. All of us living and working in British Columbia who are not Indigenous to these lands are here as settlers. The histories of racial exclusion and settler colonialism that today's conversations will focus on are inextricable from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands that long predated 1923 and which continues into the present day.
Anniversaries are opportunities to reflect on not only what has passed, but on how that past has shaped us and how in the present we can take what we've learned to proceed better informed and envision possibilities for the future. And that's not to say that we need to wait until 100 years to do so, but when I was first approached by TAC to co-organize this symposium, also via the folks at UBC, one of the first things we all discussed when we were talking about joining forces was, well, is U of T actually doing anything for the centenary? And about, the difficulty of holding our own institutions that we work at accountable to their ongoing anti-Asian racism and colonial practices. And so while we certainly shouldn't wait 100 years to reflect on such things, a centenary really does help us get the funding that we need in order to do so in these kinds of spaces. And in the very first meeting with Tak, Henry, Naomi, and Jenny, it became clear really quickly that though we were organizing a symposium to commemorate 100 years of Chinese exclusion in Canada, we didn't want to restrict our conversation to either Canada or the nature of just anti-Chinese racism. The remarkable scholars who accepted our invitation to join us today helped us make this vision possible. Admittedly, many did agree with the caveat that they were not exactly experts on 1923 anti-Chinese racism, or what is so often termed the exclusion era in Canada. And some were, simply being humble, but even if they were being honest, that was particularly our point. What we aimed was to put together a conversation where we could address Asian and diasporic issues and inequities that have always existed, but have really been brought into sharp focus because of the COVID crisis and mounting geopolitical tensions. And we wanted these conversations to be set within the broader concurrent themes that we've put together today of imperialism, settler colonialism, and capital. Because racial exclusion in any one nation state doesn't occur in isolation or exception, but under this wider umbrella of white supremacy. And so just in the land that we now call Canada, Chinese exclusion occurred on the terrain of stolen Indigenous lands in a sub-imperial space in response to global networks of Asian labor migration, capital flows, imperial contests, and collaborations. And as we have already begun to allude to earlier, it was not the only project of white supremacy occurring in 1923. In a world bound together by these networks, Chinese exclusion in Canada is only one chapter in a much larger anthology.
One of the most enduring legacies of the Chinese Exclusion Act that has lasted since the Canadian government passed it on July 1st, 1923, is in how it singled out the Chinese Canadian community as different, as unlike any other racial or ethnic group, legally speaking, in Canada. But I think one of the most valuable things to come out of the various commemorative efforts for the centenary has been in the conversations it's opened up among both Chinese Canadians and non-Chinese Canadians alike. When we're able to understand these moments as part of the broader project of settler colonialism and white supremacy, it opens up pathways for forging mutual connections between communities and individuals. And I think there's something really powerful in being able to challenge the isolation that the Exclusion Act intended to enforce upon the Chinese Canadian community and other racialized communities by opening a dialogue, by forging relationships and common understandings with other racialized communities, not just in Canada, but around the world. Therefore, the goal of this symposium is to reflect on, grapple with, and discuss the contemporary significance of racial exclusion during the 1920s in North America and around the world. Given the complexity and diversity of these temporal and spatial parameters, we knew we would have to draw from cross-disciplinary scholars from sites across Transpacific spaces to even come close to convening the conversations we wanted to have. We hope that the questions, panels, and panelists that we have assembled today will offer contemporary and historical perspectives along with global and regional perspectives to examine how this era of racial exclusion resonates into present-day issues of race, empire, colonialism, and discrimination. Throughout this half-day symposium, there will be 3 moderated panel sessions that will each run for an hour and a half. Sessions will run conversationally, with the moderators posing questions to the panelists to discuss and intervene with one another. Each session will include a 20-minute question and answer period with audience members, and you'll be able to submit questions via the chat. The first panel of the day is called North American Perspectives on 1923. This panel will focus its discussion around North America to think transnationally about how Chinese exclusion across the continent fits into larger conversations of racial formation and settler colonialism. Panel 2, Asian settler colonialism and Pacific empires, will shift its focus to Pacific empires and ask, how do conversations about empires and settler colonialism change when we expand our focus beyond white empires to consider Asian empires, when we center the Pacific, and when we reframe our periodization to include indigenous temporalities, histories, and knowledges? And finally, panel 3, looking back from 2023, we'll consider what does placing 1923 and 2023 in conversation alongside each other reveal about both our present and our not so distant past? Or conversely, how might we understand issues facing Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples today as rooted in longer genealogies of race, empire, and colonialism?
So in gathering these three panels together, we really hope to facilitate a conversation that resists those disciplinary conventions that too often isolate our fields from one another. And in including so many diverse voices, we hope to avoid privileging Chinese issues over any other racialized group. Instead, we wish to present a mediation on 1923 that follows a model of solidarity in academia that is supportive rather than smothering, to borrow a phrase from Kanaka scholar Wahikeya Maile. And with that said, without further ado, please join us in welcoming virtually all of our symposium panelists and moderators. Thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Are we good? Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel and Naomi, and the whole organizing team. This is so incredible. I'm so excited about the lineup for today. And I'm really excited for this first panel and the privilege of moderating it. For whoever doesn't know me, my name is Nicole Yakashiro. I'm a PhD student at UBC, studying things. I study property, settler colonialism, and Asian Canadian history more broadly. So I'll give you that small introduction. More significantly, more importantly, I'm going to introduce the panelists for this first session on what we're calling North American Perspectives on 1923. One of the things we did talk about as we were coming together is that many of the scholars here probably can speak on all of the panels today to some extent. So there might be some overlap, but I think that'll be an exciting thing rather than a hindrance to the discussion today. So I'm going to introduce first Dr. Laura Ishiguro, who's a historian of settler colonialism in Northwestern North America. And at the University of British Columbia, she is the director of Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies, associate professor in the Department of History, and faculty associate of the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Welcome, Laura. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Laura Madokoro, who is a historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University in Algonquin Territory. She is the author of Elusive Refuge, Chinese Migrants in the Cold War, the co-editor of Dominion of Race, Rethinking Canada's International History, and a member of the editorial collective at activehistory.ca and the co-director of the journal Social History. My French is awful, so I'm not going to pronounce the first part of it. Yeah. Third, I'd like to welcome Mayan Shah, who is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California. He is the author of 3 incredible books: Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco's Chinatown, Stranger Intimacy, Contesting Race, Sexuality, and the Law in North American West, and most recently, Refusal to Eat, A Century of Prison Hunger Strikes. So his research examines and uncovers how people struggle with illness, migration, and incarceration in the US and across the globe from the 19th century to the present. And last but not least is Timothy Stanley, who is a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Education and Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies at the University of Ottawa. He is an award-winning historian of racism and the Chinese Canadian experience. Anti-racist education is his primary interest. And his current research focuses on kind of educational implications of linkages between racist exclusions, historical memory, and the construction of our surrounding cultural landscapes. And as I'm introducing folks, I also want to flag that in previous iterations, Lisa Rose Marr was on the panel as well, but unfortunately she couldn't be here today. So for now, I will introduce these four wonderful panelists. And today we're also going to kind of have an organic conversation. And I also want to encourage the folks as we have our conversation, please put your questions in the chat and I will get to them towards the end. So we'll talk for about 45 minutes to an hour and then we'll go to your questions, okay? So firstly, I thought I'd open up today with a pretty broad question. It's organized around this date, 1923. And I just wanted to offer to the panelists this prompt of, how would you describe this historical moment? We can think of 1923 as attached to like the Chinese Exclusion Act, but of course we know that there's broader contexts that are shaping this moment. So I thought I'd really give it to you to think about when you think of 1923, what is kind of the context, the historical context that maybe we should bring to bear as we begin our discussion for today. Would anyone like to get us started? Or should I pick on someone? Laura, go ahead.
I will happily, one of the Lauras will volunteer. I just want to start by saying thank you for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and Nicole, you as moderator. It's a real treat. So I am very grateful for this conversation and this opportunity to reflect. And one of the things that I have been thinking about in considering this 1923 moment is just what the world looked like globally in 1923. And I recognize we're speaking on the North American panel, but I think it's really important to consider that this is post First World War. There was incredible displacement globally. And what that meant for states was a real exertion of power in terms of controlling who was going to be admitted and who is going to be excluded. And so when I think about the 1923 moment, there is a very particular Chinese diaspora, Chinese Canadian, Chinese American story, but there's also a larger story around what was happening to people who were displaced globally and the extent to which states were very reluctant to admit. And in the Canadian context, even more so than the United States, very reluctant to support refugees, for instance, from Armenia, from Russia. And so I think this is part of the larger story as we think about the 1923 moment. It is a moment of intense migration, intense displacement, but also intense state control and really the exertion of power in order to restrict mobility.
Thanks, Laura. Go ahead,
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a really important set of framings about what's happening in terms of World War I and its aftermath. I also want to just sort of emphasize that World War I was also a moment of massive movements and mobilizations. So people also traverse the globe in this war. And there are, of course, I think people in Canada might be more aware of this than, say, people in the United States about how sort of South Asian and Chinese workers came across Canada one way or the other on their way to fighting the war in Europe, how there were South Asian soldiers and African soldiers that were in Europe and in other parts of the globe during World War I and the war. So there's a massive movement of people that's just occurred, a great deal of dislocation. And for the moment of us reflecting also what life is like in the sort of where we move from pandemic to endemic, I mean, it's really worth recognizing that this is also the moment of a series of kind of crises around illness and death. The influenza pandemic and its ravages are impacting the globe. And I thought there was something really interesting about Canada per se here in this, is that apparently there's, 66,000 people died in Canada that were Canadian who were in World War I, but 40,000 at least died in the 1918-1920 period who were died because of influenza, and many of them were between the ages of 20 to 40, which was not unusual for the influenza pandemic, that many younger people died in that wave. And I think it's important to understand that we're thinking about what this remaking of society is, about mobility, about living and dying, about work, and is this capitalist system going to continue, as there are other kinds of revolutionary struggles that are also moving apace in the globe. So it's a lot of different moving parts that are going, where states are working to produce different forms of what they think is stability or boundaries, and they're doing it on many different levels.
If I could just add to that, I think another thing that comes out of the First World War is a kind of reconfiguration of the structures of imperialism and colonization. So, coming out of the Versailles peace treaties, fundamentally the right of self-determination for people in Europe, and the white places of settlement, and basically colonial control for the rest of the peoples of the world. In China, for example, when China comes into the war in a latter stage, and then at the Treaty of Versailles, the German territories are given over to the German controlled territories are given over to the Japanese, and as just an example. And coming with this sort of higher level of global imperialism is also a kind of perfection or a completion of the formation of white supremacist states and state systems around the world. We see this very clearly in Canada, for example, in the 1923 Exclusion Act. It's enacted by a parliament that has no people of color, no Indigenous people, let alone any Asians in Parliament. It actually only had one woman who had just been elected at the previous election. So it's literally is a system that is made up and controlled by white men. And this is directly linked to the whole project of settler colonialism, which is about taking the territories of Indigenous people and converting it to the private property of people from Europe, and in the British Empire, particularly people of British origins. And we also see that, for example, the specific policies go back and forth between different state formations. So in the British Empire, for example, the policies that we see in Canada are very much informed by policies that are also being pursued in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa. In fact, the original draft of the Exclusion Act, which passed the House of Commons, had something in it called the Natal Formula, under which people to enter the country, and originally would have applied to all Chinese people, including the Canadian-born over the age of 16, would have had to or the age of 15 would have had to pass a language test to stay in the country. The Senate, after lobbying by the Chinese, takes that out. But this is just an example of this sort of global white supremacy. And of course, to put it in North American context, much of the debate is also centered around avoiding the problems that the United States has with its race problem, as they called it, in other words, the oppression of African Americans. So yeah, it's very much a global process.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Laura, did you want to jump in? Laura,
I'll jump in just with a couple of points in it. And I think thinking about this 1920s moment as a particular reconfiguration, as my panelists have spoken to, of global politics of exclusion, white supremacy, settler colonialism, but also that extension of a much longer project in Northern North America. And I think there are two additional examples that I think really shed light on the 1920s as this particular escalation in the Canadian context. One, as Tim flagged for us, that we really need to think about this as part of a wider structure of settler colonialism and white supremacy, and how that manifests in the Canadian context as in relationship with a project of a colonial project of theft of Indigenous lands and a genocidal politics of replacement for Indigenous peoples. And, the 1923 Act comes shortly after the escalation of the Indian residential schooling system in 1920 that becomes mandatory for all Indigenous kids. And, I'm speaking from Musqueam territory in Vancouver. And in the British Columbian context, we're also talking about the aftermath of a series of contestations around land. A long history of colonial contestations over land, but the aftermath of the Royal Commission and really significant expansion of Indigenous organizing in the teens and early 20s. And I think that the 20s really sees an escalation in that particular project of dispossession focused on land. The other thing that I wanted to flag, and this is the thing that I really think about alongside the 1923 Exclusion Act, because I think that we often talk about this kind of exclusion happening at the borders. And we need to think about what is happening within the borders, but I also think we need to talk about immigration restriction alongside deportation politics. And the 1920s are this really crucial moment of the escalation of deportation, particularly focused on Chinese Canadian people. And the other act that I really think this alongside is the drug laws in Canada. And across the 1920s, the intensification of opium and other drugs acts, which allow for the deportation intensely focused on Chinese Canadian people. And so this comes from Catherine Carstairs and Susan Boyd. Between 1923 and 1932, almost 2% of the Chinese Canadian population was deported on drugs convictions. And I think that thinking about that alongside an era of exclusion really underscores that this isn't the Exclusion Act on its own, but part of a much broader slew of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, and white supremacist politics in this period.
Yeah, thanks so much. Oh, sorry, I'm so excited. I'm both moderator and audience member, partly because, it's really exciting to talk about a specific moment, the Exclusion Act, and then immediately kind of burst it open and see what else is kind of shaping the specific moment. And I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about my own work, but I was thinking a little bit, as Tim mentioned, the Natal formula, is that also what's happening after the First World War is the kind of discussion around soldier settlement. And currently I was just in the archives and looking at this conversation around land and property. And one of the key ways that people are looking to discourage Asian property ownership or land ownership on Indigenous territories is by claiming that this is land reserved for soldiers after the war. So really great and really helpful for me as well. So amazing. So we're talking about this 1920s moment and talking about the kind of the reconfiguration of states' boundaries in this moment, these white supremacist systems, as well as what I was just saying about this not being restricted to borders by any means. And so in that spirit, and given the title of our panel, we are talking about kind of this North American context. So I'm curious to hear what you might have to say about kind of imploding the sense that the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act is a Canadian history, and thinking about this as what can we learn by putting this in the context of what's happening in the US? You can feel free to go globally. I know that we don't have to be restricted to North America. For example, we're talking about the 1920s, but we also know that we have a US Exclusion Act in 1882. And so what does this mean about these kind of different moments in time, and thinking more transnationally about both these exclusion acts, but also these kind of different forms of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism that are kind of shaping these forms of legislation, not only in the 1920s, but also in the earlier periods as well. Does that make sense? I hope so. Does anyone want to jump in and speak to that at all?
I can start a little bit with this and to say there's been a dynamic since the 1860s of communication occurring between Canada and the United States around how to deal with the Chinese problem, and they're identifying it and they're sharing information. It's, Chinese, it's commissions that are occurring in Canada that are influencing legislation that occurs in San Francisco in the 1870s, and inquiries that are going on there around concerns about Chinese laborers, Chinese women, worries about the sort of ideas about corruption, about anti-democratic elements within Chinese migration, that's sort of obedience to the emperor. There's all these different kinds of worries that are being pulled together. In some way, one way of thinking about it is that there are two different tracks that occur in U.S. and Canadian legislation. Similar interests, but two different tracks. So if you think that the U.S. government after a long process of failure, legislated an Exclusion Act in 1882 that was excluding Chinese laborers, but managing immigration of Chinese business people, people who were diplomats, people who were scholars, and their dependents. And that's what the exclusion era in the United States looks like, from 1882 to a series of laws and regulations building up a whole system for immigration regulation that gets applied then to many other people. All the other migrants are coming in. I mean, and the way in which to think about the deportation system that develops in the United States also similarly comes from the experience with how to regulate the Chinese. And so in this period of time in the United States, 1882 to the 1920s, there are lots of different ways in which Chinese migrants who want to move back and forth are trying to and move up to Canada for a time and then move down to Mexico. They're trying to negotiate this system. And this is a period of regulated migration. It is regulated to ostensibly exclude Chinese laborers. What did the Canadians do? The Canadians developed a head tax system, a taxation system of which, by the way, the US had started off on trying to get revenue out of Chinese migration in California and the ports and stuff like that. They did that already. They created various forms of taxes, but the federalized system, the system that Canada as a dominion of state figures out, is to do a head tax, and trying to do that as a way of saying, okay, well, unless you have this money, you couldn't possibly be a laborer. And so they create this taxation system, which goes on and morphs and changes. And there are people here who have much better insight on those details. But it's kind of curious to me to think, as someone who's worked mostly on Chinese US and more South Asian migration across both borders, to see that the move for an Exclusion Act occurs in 23 in Canada, by which time in the United States, and in Canada, they've already figured out ways of regulating the Japanese, South Asian migrants. In the United States in 21 and 24, they are ramifying an entire quota system, a racial quota system for everyone that might be coming to the United States. So in 21 and 24, that's what the US is kind of worried about. It's like Asians, well, we already dealt with that problem. Now we're going to worry about the Galatians, the Armenians, the Romanians, the Germans, anyone, everyone else. So it's an interesting kind of thing to think about how this is working, about how these kinds of systems are operating, because what it tells us is that there's a kind of sharing of information that's going on between these states. There's a share of political anxieties that are percolating. There's a lot of different ways in which white settler definitions of who counts as a citizen is being made, and who could possibly become part of that, and where the boundaries are going to be lying. But the strategies are differently aligned, and some of them are really properly with Canada within the kind of framework of the British Empire, and all sorts of kind of exigencies around that. And I know there are people on the panel who have more to say about that, but I just wanted to give that framework to say that this is interesting to see how this operates.
I think Naomi is quite right in terms of these influences back and forth. I mean, the 1885 Royal Commission on Chinese Immigration in Canada has a whole appendix, which is on the report to the U.S. Congress that went into their Exclusion Act. And calls for exclusion have been around since at least the early 1870s. But in British Columbia in particular, the focus was more on building a state. And from its inception, Indigenous people and Chinese are excluded. The third act of the BC legislature, bans them. At that point, the Indigenous people are like at least 5 times by a factor of at least 5, the majority of the population, etc. So another influence that is quite clearly is in terms of the representations of the Chinese that we see in the discourse on Chinese exclusion. For example, very strongly, we can see this, for example, in the labor press, which builds on American. It's virtually often just reproduces the American stuff as well. But Naomi's also right that there's complications in Canada, but it's links to British imperialism. And one of those links was the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, which was supposed to make possible the all-red line, the all-British imperial line, allowing direct communication between England and Hong Kong and ultimately the Far East. The trouble is you needed to pay for it. And the idea was that Chinese merchants could pay for it. So that's why the head tax applied to workers and not merchants, because they were supposedly going to enable this. Similarly, Canadian policies towards Japanese are compounded by the fact that certainly in the early 20th century, Japan is an ally of the United Kingdom, and until 1922, in fact. So any kind of anti-Japanese legislation was protested in London, and then the imperial government was contact the Canadian government to say, what's going on here? You're interfering in our relations, etc. So there was always a bit of a fine line that was going on there. Another thing I just wanted to point out, because I think it's really important to understand kind of the rapport de force that's going on. Because of the U.S. Exclusion Act, by the 1920s, it had its Chinese American population included a sizable number of American-born people, at least as I remember, at least a third of the population. In Canada, its Canadian-born population is tiny. It's somewhere around 8% of the population. There's almost no children, and it's overwhelmingly a population of so-called bachelor males who have families in China that they couldn't bring here because of the head tax regulations, and so forth. So there's a very different kind of structure that's going on, and with that is different relations. And so part of those realities are actually people have Transpacific family relations and connections back and forth to China. My last point on this, which is there's a whole collection of letters in the Yip Song archives in Vancouver, which are people writing to people who were in transit, and the letters couldn't be delivered, so they ended up in Yip Song's possession. And a lot of them are about people who were trying to enter the States. And it's like, the reason you were sent back is that you answered the questions wrong, or stuff like this. So there's a lot of people going back and forth or trying to, which is also, I think, is a very important thing to remember.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Laura I, did you want to add anything?
I'm looking at the other Laura, but I'll just.
Oh, I had a really small thing I wanted to say to Tim's last comment, and then you can take over to the other Laura. One of the things that really struck me about that last comment, Tim, is I think we've been having this conversation about a state-designed project of white supremacy and exclusion. And the letters remind me, too, that it's not just that Canada and the US and governments in this wider kind of project of making white men's countries, it's not just that they're talking to each other, but also that that Chinese people themselves, or people who are moving through and in relation to these systems, are also sharing information. And so they're also navigating these exclusionary regimes in creative, adaptive, and connected ways too. So thinking about putting Canada in this wider context is also very much putting actual people in this wider context.
I was nodding vigorously because I also wanted to pick up on that point, Tim, which I thought was so helpful in terms of thinking about these cross-border connections. The most obvious in some ways are the fact that people are moving in multiple directions and maintaining these relationships across borders. So I really appreciated that. And the other thing I was thinking about as everyone was speaking, and particularly Naya and your comments about the way these regimes are structured differently, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is that there is an economic dimension, as you were sort of alluding to, in terms of how governments are thinking about the desirability of migrants or settlers or the undesirability. And I think it's really striking that, you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about white supremacy in more nuanced ways as we move along. But there is an economic dimension to who is considered desirable and undesirable, right? And the requirements, both in the United States and in Canada, that people have sufficient sums in order to be admitted. It's not about what they look like. It's about whether or not they have the money that will ensure that they don't become, quote, public charges. And so the other thing about this 1923 moment is there's an earlier initiative in January in Canada, and January 31st, is an order in council that's passed, Order in Council 182, that essentially bans almost all Asian, or they call it immigrants of Asiatic race, unless they're laborers, because that was considered important. I think somebody in the chat was sort of pointing to the importance of agricultural laborers in this moment. But one of the really critical things about that order in council is that even if they are desirable agricultural laborers, they still have to be able to pay or show that they have a certain amount of money. I think it's about $200 or $250, right? And so this becomes part of the way states do try and regulate migration beyond sort of categories of ethnicity. And it's really striking to me that that plays out not only in the United States and Canada, but there's similar initiatives in other white settler societies. So I think the economic dimension, and Nayan, you were pointing to this, I think it's so important in terms of how we understand what states are doing in this moment. And critically, it applies, I think, in unique ways to migrants who are coming out of Asia, but we can also see it being applied across many different categories, which I think leads us to this kind of reflection about the extent to which the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, the ways in which it's unique, but the ways in which it's also connected with these other sort of power moves on the part of states. So I just wanted to offer that point.
Thank you, Laura. Oh man, I'm divided on where I should go next, because I feel like there's kind of two strains. So maybe I will offer both, and whatever inspires you folks, you can pick up. So I mean, one of the things that I just on that last piece I wanted to speak on is basically about racial formation during this period, and that means and white supremacy, as Laura alluded to, kind of in a more nuanced way, right? How could we describe kind of not the 1923 Act, but also what's happening around it, as we've kind of already contextualized? How can we think about this as creating and shaping forms of white supremacy during this period, forms of racialization of Chinese people, but also other Asian people, other non-white people during this period? And then the other question I had was thinking, kind of going back to what Laura I was saying and Tim was alluding to, is like, what about the people? We had this kind of upper level discussion, and obviously we know that, folks are moving across the border, and I just wanted to hear more maybe about how we can perhaps reframe this discussion around the people who are actually targeted by these policies, and what we can gain from kind of reshaping or reframing this history in that way. So those are the two kind of arms I was hoping we could touch on. So if anyone wants to speak to either of those, I'd love to hear it.
I'll bite on the first one. Just if we look at the development of sort of racist and racializing discourse, it doesn't happen all at once, and it develops quite differently in Canada and in the British Empire than it does in the United States. It tends to be developed somewhat earlier in the U.S. So if you look at anti-Chinese discourse in the 1870s, 1880s, the category they're contrasting the Chinese to are Canadian and British. In 1923, the category that they're contrasting it to is white. And this reflects generally in the European world an intensification of racism built around notions of racial difference that we would understand to be biological differences. In 1885, MacDonald, disenfranchises everybody of Chinese or Mongolian race. When he's challenged by members of the opposition, because originally he was going to disenfranchise the Chinamen, and the question was, were British subjects from Hong Kong Chinamen, as one member asked. So the categories have changed. They also become universalized. You see this, development of mass media, Birth of a Nation, as an example, and also in school curriculum, explicitly teaching children about absolute differences between biologically defined racial groups. But this is not unique to Canada or the US. This is generally, I think, something that's going on in the Western world in that era. It too is an outgrowth of a change in imperialism, which sort of reaches probably its maximum extension in the late 19th century. So.
Yeah,
Thanks,
that's
Tim.
really so helpful, Tim. I was thinking, I really appreciate the way in which you framed it in terms of culture and language and how people are thinking about what their frameworks are for understanding difference that are shifting dramatically and intensifying into trying to consolidate into this idea of white and what that means and who that includes and who that doesn't. And it seems like those experiments are occurring on both this level of cultural communication and what's happening that we can see on a kind of national level or a kind of a global level, but they're also very localized as well. And I think what we have in both Canada and the United States are recognizing that there are all kinds of different regulations and restrictions that are happening on a municipal, provincial, or state level, property restrictions, business regulations, naturalization, citizenship, some of them that are very specifically marked towards Chinese. Some of them are more open, being ineligible for naturalization, for instance, voting regulations of various kinds. So there are instances where people are exercising the vote. In Canada, I think in Chinese people, a Chinese individual who's a merchant or involved in some sort of business is able to do so in the 1890s. And the United States, there are lots of different examples of this occurring. And then restrictions to stop it. So the idea of participating in the economic and political life are being restricted at the granular level and intensifying. And that stuff then becomes part of that. Well, this should be done all through Canada. This should be done all through the United States. But it's supporting this idea that there's a kind of white settler cartel. Who gets to be part of that cartel of accessing resources, distribution of rights and privileges? And it's very specifically in this case undermining Chinese, South Asian, Japanese abilities to organize capital, which they're exhibiting all kinds of ways in which they are actually organizing capital. They're participating in creating different kinds of businesses. They're trying to own property or try to work with each other to do so. And that's where we see some of the ways in which this transformation of Asians into all dispensable, disposable labor is the objective of that kind of cartel. But this is where we see the contestations occurring. The contestations are occurring by Chinese, Japanese, South Asian migrants who get caught into it around the ways in which they're being cut out and segregated out of opportunity, the way that they're literally being disabled from participation. And that's really interesting because it links to some other stuff that's going on. So the whole thing about, for instance, the intensification of opium and its relationship to deportation. I mean, out of the 1907 Vancouver race riot, right? And it's out of there that, it's the inquiry that's done into it, in which Chinese businesses request that they, want to be compensated for their losses, including ones that may be involved in actually the opium trade and the opium retail trade. And that gets all these people exercised, Mackenzie King, right? And the first opium regulation in Canada is executed in 1908, which is interesting because Canada wasn't a participant in these international compacts earlier, and they're reluctant in some way. There's all these international activities around narcotics and regulation. There are ones that are going on about trafficking as well. And yet, in that upswing in the 1920 to 1923 period, as and I think King and party come into government, right? There's this kind of upswing in the prosecution of people and the deportation of people who are involved in crimes related to opium trade. But let's just be clear. Opium and retail activity and what counts as a narcotic and how it's dispensed is also related to all sorts of other business activity. So there's all sorts of ways in which we could see that there's an interest in the Canadian state intervening in what kind of businesses are happening, who's participating in them, and also what they might be, how many they might be related to other kinds of businesses that might be supporting people to sort of cross borders without documentation, which is also occurring at this time. So it's just a really important way of seeing the larger arena of how it's the regulations are also producing different kinds of claims of, wait a minute, why don't I get to have the same rights as? Why can't I participate? Why am I being excluded? And what demands are being made on many different levels by Chinese who are in Canada, Chinese Canadians, and other Asian migrants who also experiencing similar kinds of treatment and processes. They're coming from being considered to be like the Chinese or considered to be a problem like them.
Thanks, Diane. Laura,
Yeah, I also think that we can't take any of this without talking about gender, sex, family, and reproduction, right? And while we're thinking about a project of making Canada, of making white men's countries, of making settler places in this moment, we're absolutely talking about projects that are both mobilizing discourses around gender in the project of racial formation, in the project of exclusion, but also having very real effects. So Tim has already flagged the creation of Transpacific families that are often, that in the Canadian context, those Chinese Canadian communities are often described as bachelor communities. Many of them are in relationships with local Indigenous people, for example, and the classic example that I use, Tommy Chong, who's born in Alberta just shortly after this, there are mixed race relationships here, but really those Transpacific families. But I think that when we talk about not to keep going on the opium laws, but I think when we see the arguments being made from the 1880s in the Royal Commission on Chinese Immigration in 1885, where they ask an awful lot of questions about opium, all the way through the discussions in the wake of the 1907 riot, the creation of the 1908 Opium Act, and through the 20s, that is very, very much about, in the language of protecting white women and girls from Chinese men in particular, but Asian men more broadly, where so-called opium dens are seen as sites of both temptation and risk for white women and girls. And I think we see that being mobilized in the discourses. We see it driving or helping to justify a lot of this legislation. And of course, then it has very real impacts on people's lives.
If I could just jump in and add that's also one of the arguments in favor of school segregation, which was the common, a very strong element going on at that time.
I might jump in with a quick thought, which I hope ties together what my fellow panelists have been saying. And I appreciate, Louie, Shigeru, your point about the gender dimensions, because that was such a critical part of the exclusion story, right? Throughout. And the other thing that I think is really interesting to think about, and I'm appreciating that we're approaching this question or these questions on multiple scales, right? From very intimate sort of frameworks to much broader ones. And the thing that I'm struck by, and this is something that I wanted to talk about, I'm not sure how to fit it in, so I'm going to do it now, which is this question of citizenship and what all of these various initiatives, right, with the royal commissions or these immigration regulations, these orders in council, what they were saying, both to the people subjected to the legislation and policy about what it meant to be a citizen or not, but also to the Canadian public, North American public more broadly. And I'm really, it's been really interesting this year. Melanie and Naomi were talking about the importance of anniversaries to get us to reflect. And I have reflected more on 1923 than I have previously. And in returning to the act, I was really struck this time by the emphasis on, Chinese in Canada having to carry identification documents. I hadn't noticed that previously because I've been focused so much on how effective the Immigration Act was in terms of almost excluding Chinese migrants completely. But this emphasis on both Chinese nationals and Canadian born on having to carry identification documents, I found really, really striking, because it says something about, maybe it tells us something both about what the state was trying to do, but I also wonder about what it meant for people who had to carry those identification documents, right? What it said to them and their communities about where they belonged or not in Canada or North America more broadly. And I do think there are comparisons, and I wanted to pick up on Naomi's point in the introduction about not thinking about these questions in isolation, thinking about other instances, other communities that have been asked or required to carry documents in this period. And I'm thinking, we can look in the Canadian context at things like the pass system that was introduced after 1885 for Indigenous peoples, that they had to carry documents, they had to request permission in order to be able to move or to leave reserves. And similarly, during the Second World War, Japanese Canadians were required to carry identity documents, and that carried over until 1949, right after the war. What does that mean for people who are subject to these controls, where they actually, their relationship to documents and to the states also shapes the relationships that they foster with one another beyond community? And I do think there are many lessons many lessons or examples that we can share that are related to this, that I would love to hear my fellow panelists reflect on, because to me, there's something really important happening in this moment around questions of citizenship, not just what the state is doing, but also how people are thinking about their status as citizens or not, and what that means more generally. So I just want to offer that point. Thanks, Nicole, for indulging.
Laura, I put in the chat a certificate of Annie Fong, who was 8 years old, who had to register under the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Annie Fong lived to be 100. And she kept these with her, and those certificates of her sisters when they died, and her mother, who had to get a replacement certificate for paying the head tax. I know this because she was my mother. So I'm convinced that, despite everything else, that she had a very rich and wonderful life in Montreal. In the back of her mind, there was always this idea that somehow, you're not quite allowed to be part of this place. Otherwise, why keep those? She kept that, her marriage certificate, her birth certificate, along with those things. This is something to think about.
Yeah, maybe I mean, feel free to also jump in if any of you have any other further thoughts. I know I feel like I need to create more pauses so that we can actually just like digest and think about what we might want to respond to. But maybe I will just reiterate, like, if anyone has any further thoughts around kind of I know we've already talked a little bit about kind of the intimacies of this process, but also how, yeah, like how do these pieces of legislation, what do they look like in people's everyday lives, I guess, is maybe what I can ask. And I know we've already spoken a little bit about, speaking back to the broader question around this North American perspective and how people were actually moving across borders. So of course it makes sense for us to talk about them beyond just the nation state. But yeah, I'm curious if any of you had any further thoughts on how we might kind of talk about these intimacies of this process. And likewise, actually, I was thinking about the kind of second question I wanted to share was going back to Laura M's question around, or you mentioned thinking about the anniversary. And I also am like really interested in the politics of commemoration and thinking about how the origin of this symposium, and I think Melanie talked about this in her introductory remarks as well, how anniversaries are very good for funding. But thinking about, like when we think about 1923 as a moment, and especially in the Canadian context, how like what might be the limitations of tying it to that moment? I'm thinking about, my own perspective as a Japanese Canadian person, and how 1942 is kind of this very fixed date, kind of I love I think Krista McAllister talks about like the narrative fixity of 1942. And I don't know if 1923 has the same kind of hold on the Chinese Canadian community. I don't necessarily think it does, because I think there's lots of other stuff going on. But I'm curious to hear maybe your thoughts about how we commemorate significant moments in history that are legislated by the state, but the whole story is not determined by the state. And what might be the limitations and what might be the possibilities of how we can teach otherwise, both students, both the public. This is a public event. Yeah, how might we think about 1923 and also kind of go beyond it as a form of periodization? So maybe I'll toss those to you. Toss those thoughts to you.
I'm gonna, if I may, I'll just jump in quickly because I actually have many thoughts on this, and I'm going to try and retain my corral myself. It's been fascinating, right, this year to see the commemoration and to see the amount of storytelling that's happened in terms of people's own family histories. And I've been really struck by, the generosity with which people have shared their stories. Also I think raising questions about what happens when these stories are shared, right? What is our responsibility to listen, to hear, to act? And I do think that one of the challenging things around 1923 is in my mind, it's not just a Chinese Canadian story. It's not just a Canadian story. And yet it can very easily be framed that way, right? And people can say, well, that happened to this particular community. It doesn't affect, anyone else. And I think that's obviously quite incorrect in terms of, if we think broadly about state powers, but just in terms of, the impact of the act in terms of what families lost and their ability to be together and to create families. That's one dimension we can look at. And I've been thinking about this really interesting research being done by Amy Fung, who is a PhD candidate at Carleton, and she's looking at the politics of mourning and the capacity for white settler societies to mourn racialized loss. And I have been wondering about that a great deal this year in terms of these extraordinary stories that are being shared and the really intense responsibility that we all have to make sure that we're paying attention to these stories, and not just paying attention, but really thinking about how they are implicated and affect all of us. So it's not just, one community's story. And I do think that's a danger with thinking just about 1923, is we do risk that isolation. But I think there's been a lot of really good work to make those connections, and that's been really heartening. But it's certainly been something that I've been thinking about that way.
Thanks, Laura. Tim, go ahead.
I had the privilege of being at the Canadian Senate on the 100th anniversary of their passage of the Act, when they had a special ceremony in commemoration. And this is organized by Senators Yuan-Pao Wu and Victor O. And the next day there was a rally on Parliament Hill with about 5,000 people from Chinese Canadians across Canada who were marking the Act and its links about contemporary concerns over exclusion. So I think one of the important things of this kind of anniversary for people within the Chinese Canadian community, if I could speak as somebody who's a semi outsider, I guess, or more of an outsider than insider, is actually a moment where a lot of more recent people of Chinese origin who've come to Canada have discovered that there's this long history of racist exclusion. And particularly as they experience the exclusions, intense racism, COVID-related racism, I think this has been an important wake-up call. Just if I can make I have a kind of a thought on historical consequences of this that it might be interesting for some young PhD student to look at. Is I think this was possibly the first, certainly one of the first times anywhere in the world that a population defined by race had to be registered. And that became a policy that has been pursued by other repressive regimes, not the least of which were the Nazis afterwards. And I think similarly in apartheid South Africa. And that might be a very interesting thread to follow in terms of that kind of an influence, just something to think about. In Canada, we know that Japanese Canadians also voluntarily registered in 1941 to prove that there was no illegal immigration, which meant that the RCMP knew where they all lived when they rounded them up the next year. But, and so just something to think about.
Thanks, Tim. Laura, Nyan, you want to add anything? Go ahead.
Just actually on what Tim said just now, I mean, the Geary Act in 1892, actually did that same thing of creating that certificate for Chinese residents to register and obtain a certificate of residence. It was highly contested and stuff like that. But it is interesting that, I think Marilyn Lake and other scholars have looked at this kind of global ways in which racial projects around racial restriction or group restriction were being created, and these technologies to make it possible to do it was very much of this era, this 1880s to 1940s and 50s. And there's a reason that those kinds of techniques of control are being administered and how they're being applied to particular groups, and why we see there's this connection between the past laws in apartheid South Africa, which is later, but also the earlier sort of manifestations of apartheid activity on indigenous peoples and on Asians in all these different settler communities. Is sort of this longer history of documentation papers. And I think the other thing to think about, and I was really impressed with sort of seeing on the chat, not just the one that you shared, Tim, but the other ones that have been collected. I think it's really important for people to see where the sort of fixing of individual and racial documentation occurs, because we're seeing it ramify into almost a thing that people now think of maybe uncritically, but still have these moments of very intense, what is this doing? How am I marked? What does this limit me to? Am I always vulnerable to some kind of violence, reprisal? Can I trust anyone who's supposed to be protecting me or protecting my liberty? So it's this kind of interesting problem around just thinking about how it might also immobilize people in their fear, their concern. It's certainly immobilized. All these regulations immobilize different forms of Transpacific families from being able to unite or connect, even though there are many different strategies people use to try to keep those connections going. It's really important to think about the forces of immobilization that are happening, even as people are trying, and people also feeling like they have to be fugitives in order to do what they might think of in terms of their everyday life. I think those are important elements we might think of in our larger experience today of what different forms of surveillance and marking and documenting may make us feel like, is possible or not possible.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have so much to say on all of this, and I will try to rein it in. I mean, I think that there are particular points to make about public commemoration and these moments for public conversation, but I also think this gets so to the heart of what we think history is for. And a lot of this is about the risks and possibilities of different kind of history telling in general. And I was thinking about this for two reasons. One, this language of moments, as some people will know, really strikes me because in the UBC History Department, our introductory Canadian history course is now called History of Canada Moments That Matter. And we've designed it around guest lectures where we choose certain moments. And as I've seen this play out over the last, I don't remember, 8 years or so, I think it does really, really valuable and useful things as a course. And I also think that the language of moments forecloses some other kinds of history telling that are really important or make it harder. And I was thinking about this again because the Canadian history magazine called Canada's History, it has just announced they're running a competition for I think school kids right now on moments that matter in Chinese immigration history. And so they're also asking kids across the country to send in, to pick their moment and to say what matters in understanding the history of Chinese immigration to this place. And I think one of the risks of, or one of the limits of the language of moments is it tends to elevate the state regulation, the laws, these single acts, and it draws our attention, or it can draw our attention away from thinking about structures as they're built and lived and maintained over time. It can draw our attention away from how actual people navigate them, live them. It draws our attention away from social histories often. It doesn't necessarily or inherently do that, but there is this temptation to see these single acts. It helps us understand these state projects of exclusion in some ways, but it can also risk us seeing them as isolated incidents. Bad people in 1923 did this bad thing. And that, I think, would be a shame if that's what we walk away from a commemoration understanding. And I think that the conversations to situate these in wider context, to really think about how people navigate them, live them, also how people come up with, talk to people in other countries, come up with the ideas of these laws, enact them, live them, and resist them is really, really crucial. And so I think one of the things that I'm almost done my monologue here, but one of the things I really want to say is one of the arguments that I hear most often about why understanding these moments matter is because otherwise we're doomed to repeat them. And I hate this. And I hate this for lots of reasons, but one of the things is that I don't think that understanding inherently means that we don't do something like that. You know, history in and of itself doesn't repeat. We do see patterns. We do see a drawing from historical structures and lessons and reconfiguring them. But there's nothing inherent in historical understanding that means we don't do harm again or sustain structures that do harm and violence to people. And so I think it's really how we talk about these histories that can allow for a kind of critical hope and reimagining our own futures. And I think one of the things for me in talking about these histories is that they should remind us that we had active and creative ancestors who weren't necessarily men of their times, but rather imagined all kinds of possibilities and made all kinds of choices in conditions that they didn't necessarily choose or control. And I do think that there is, we do need to simultaneously understand the harm, the violence, the structures that these are embedded in, and the ways that people continue to make choices and act in these situations.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Laura. Tim's giving you A little applause. I just wanted to remind everyone, I know folks put in the chat, but we'll have a little question period shortly. So if you do have any questions, make sure you get them in there and I will try to get to them. I know some of the questions I saw earlier we might have already answered. So apologies if I skipped those ones just out of the I don't know, parameters of time. Wow, cannot talk. Maybe the last 5 minutes or so before we move to questions. I kind of got through all of my questions and I just wanted to maybe allow us to consolidate and take a moment to maybe think about our whole discussion so far. And if there's anything that we didn't get to talk about that any of the panelists would really like to get to. I know we talked about questions of periodization, of scale, like these global imperial patterns to kind of the Canada-US context, but also kind of these trans-Pacific mobilities of Chinese migrants themselves and trans-Pacific, but also cross-border movements, and then kind of the intimate parts of people's lives carrying certificates with them. What does that actually mean? I really loved how Naomi, you articulated this kind of sense of perhaps this question of like vulnerability or immobilization. And think I was actually thinking, man, clearly I'm a fan of your work because I was just reading the introduction to Stranger Intimacy and you talk a lot about like transience and permanence. And so also thinking about how these ideas of movement or permanence are shaped in the settler colonial state is something I've been thinking about a lot as settler colonialism aims to be this permanent project, and kind of the danger of mobility and how migrants threaten that project in a lot of ways. So anything you'd like to talk about before we move on to questions, feel free. Does anyone want to touch on anything else? Are we good?
Okay, I'll bite. To me, an important thing to sort of think about all this is about this where my anti-racism education stuff comes in. We talk about racism as it's an individual problem that bad people do, and it's in fact it's a social structure. They are social structures because there's more than one. And states make a major role in organizing those social structures, but they exist at the level of our everyday interactions with the human beings around us. And that's something I think that's really important to understand. Changing those kinds of structures is in the end something that takes political organizing and action, because the only thing that can really do it is governments. So that's just something to think about. It's my last thought.
Thank you, Tim. Man, I saw you unmute yourself. I don't want to pressure you, but did you want to speak at all?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the most, you evoked the way I thought about Stranger Intimacy, and that was just out of the idea that there aren't sources, the same kind of sources that immigration history has been built on, or histories of people where the sort of invitation and the expectation of permanence is built to the different ways which we think about these migration histories. And we often think of that as a kind of like, oh, this is a tremendous loss, but I wanted to sort of pick up where Laura was aiming us, trying to think about the varieties of creativity by which people are dodging and evading and trying to remake and adapt to, as Tim said, the structures that are coming in everyone's everyday life. These are not just imposed, these are not just the things you hear about or read about. These are actually affecting you and your movement, your possibility, your psychic life, your imagination. And yet people are thinking very creatively about it. And where sometimes these traces emerge are very much in the records of the state, which is human rights things, but they're also emerging in other places. And I think that one of the things that we want to, I think this opportunity provides, is that by talking about these moments or events that get this kind of attention of commemoration, people might find there are ways in which exactly to share their stories, to share their other kinds of ephemera in their lives that may have been their relationship with the state, may have been letters, may have been photographs, in which they want to interpret and share with all of us what the meanings they're making of it. And the meanings aren't always straightforward, and they're not always in the arc of permanence, and they're not always in the arc of knowing that maybe political power and citizenship were elusive, but people still made different forms of what they saw as important and values in their life and their community, how they took care of each other, how they found ways of supporting each other. And I think that that's really important. It sort of shows up in different kinds of ways as we think about the changes that occur in people's lives. And that may not show up in property records, that may not show up in political participation in the ways in which we imagine. But I was also just so struck by, the Lisa Mark couldn't join us, but she wrote this article and has done further research on these organized legal strikes that occurred for people who were undocumented in the 1940s, whose documentation was shaky, and they were fighting. They were Chinese workers that were fighting for the right to claim, different kinds of deductions on their taxes, because they couldn't claim their families, because their families weren't allowed to be in Canada, but they had families and they were supporting people across the ocean, and they felt like they weren't being allowed, they were being punished and not allowed to, both punished twice, like not allowed to have their families with them, and also fearing that they couldn't even send enough money to family members. And it just made me think, in World War II, there were remittance strategies that were occurring when you had total war. That means there are systems and networks at play where people are finding ways of communicating and transmitting money and stuff like that beyond the state. And they're using their own kinds of networks and communities, some of which are, admittedly, they might be dodgy and problematic, but maybe no less so than their experiences with banking systems, the official ones, who may treat them and mistreat them so poorly. So I think that it's really important that we think about, yes, we're looking for sort of the signs of the different sort of stakes around making claims and stuff like that. We see that erupt, but they also tell us a story of movement and mobility, and that really upset the states who are trying to control and regulate and determine who's who and where they belong, and sodding them in ways that are so harmful and so counter the possibilities of the people that we're so interested in. And I know it's a difficult sort of maneuver to make, but I think we can do it in ways that I think are really exciting. Also at a time when, say, archival possibilities are rendered through social media and through people's own collecting and strategies as much more democratic, much more wide open. And they find their way into institutions that, of course, matter to preserve these legacies and stuff like that, the exhibitions that are happening. But I want to sort of just call out the process of collecting material and stories and stuff like that. That's an organic, community-based, communal effort that celebrates the evasions that are being done, as well as the sort of markers of how people, their lives are being fixed or tethered in ways that were really hard or impossible for them. But they also found ways to tell their story. And I think we want to sort of celebrate the ways in which people's stories are being shared and told, and what they mean about the larger meaning making that we're doing. But anyway, I went on too long here, but
not at all. That was beautifully said. Maybe I'll pick up where you just took us, actually, because one of the questions that the chat has offered is a question about sources. So maybe that was a great segue, actually. So, and feel free to take this further as well, panelists, if you want to talk more broadly about this question of archives and sources and kind of scale too. I feel like that's what I was thinking about, at least when you were talking about kind of from the ground up, this kind of different types of collection of materials. And I know the paper trail exhibit at the Chinese Canadian Museum is a really good example of that, of families kind of coming and donating or copying their certificates. So one of the questions someone asks is essentially about Chinese language sources and how Chinese language sources can change or enhance our understanding of the 1923 moment, of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But as we said, maybe it's not a moment, maybe it's a bigger moment. But essentially this question of, how might Chinese language sources help us? And if any of you could speak to that at least a little bit.
If you want to understand, if you understand racism to be a relationship, you need to engage with the self-representations of the people who are on the receiving end, the people being excluded. And that actually what makes the structure visible and its consequences and the ways that it affects. And also, as just emphasizing what not the kind of stuff Nyan was talking about, the ways that people get on with their lives and survive. So you do need to look at Chinese language sources. In Canada, the main Chinese language source for this era is Dahang Gungbao, the Chinese Times, published in Vancouver. There's other newspapers published, but we tend not to have the complete runs. There are also something like 800 little archival collections across Canada of different letters and stuff that people were written in Chinese that need to be looked at. There's also a huge amount of sources in China, Chinese newspapers, which were reporting on events like this, as well as archival sources. For example, the governments of China, both the revolutionary government in the south and the government in Beijing, were trying to negotiate a gentleman's agreement with the federal government where they would voluntarily limit Chinese immigration. And those archives are actually in Canada right now, but also some of them are now available in China. So it's essential. But the problem here is that, at least in Canada and amongst Canadian historians, we've imagined Canada's history to be English and French. And the reality is that's not what it is. And then the other set of sort of important sources are the family stories, the family traditions, etc., and the oral traditions that exist within communities. Is sort of essential. We really want to get into this stuff. It's not just the debates in the House of Commons.
Thanks, Tim. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was just going to explain. I'm going to put a link in chat. This is a piece that Teresa Wong published in the CBC recently that I think also speaks to the ways in which, although a state is rigorously collecting this information, it's also not the ways in which people, sorry, I'm doing two things at the same time, the ways in which those state records are also not capturing and telling people's stories in a full way. And I love the conclusion that the proof, that people descendants are already the proof and the knowledge of this history as well. And so I just wanted to add that in this conversation.
And if I could, I just want to make a point about the kinds of questions that we ask of the sources that we know about. And the way that if we keep asking the same kinds of questions, we keep looking for the same kinds of sources, and it tends to perpetuate certain kinds of narratives. And so one of the things that, and especially given this panel's focus on transborder relationships and connections, I think one of the dangerous things with archives is that they are very, very rooted. And it is, I'm going to echo what many people have said already in terms of the value of family sources and personal collections. But even more than that, it's the questions that we ask of these letters. So one of the things about the 1923 legislation is that it did keep people out of Canada, and yet, this goes to what Nyan was saying. It's not the end of their, the end of their stories by any measure. They did different things, and they may have decided, Canada's a deeply racist place. We have no interest in going there. And those are the kinds of, if we ask questions about what refusal looks like or what resistance looks like, then we can actually come up, I think, with different answers from the sources that exist, and maybe seek new and different kinds of sources, which is also important. And many of those sources are not within the Canadian context, right? They're part of the diasporic story. And so that's really important, I think, as we think about what sources, are available, could be available. It leads us, I think, to be innovative in our questions and our research methodologies.
Can I just
Thanks.
add one more important thing about
Of course,
sources?
Tim, yeah.
Sometimes it's actually important to listen to the silences. What aren't you finding? What aren't you hearing? Because it doesn't mean it's not happening. And in fact, the greater the forms of oppression, that's also part of the reality. You get just a tiny little inklings of that. But so this is where I think it's really important as historians or as any concerned people that there's a whole aspect of bearing witness to what we're not seeing, to what we're not hearing, even though we know it's there. So.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I was also, as you're both talking, or Laura, especially when you're talking about forms of the questions we're asking, but also thinking about it being beyond this binary of like being a passive victim and like a resistor too, and also like asking ourselves questions of what does that look like when people are doing a multitude of things and strategizing in lots of different ways at the same time. At least that's what I've been thinking about a lot as well, is seeing people in their full complexity in this moment as well. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to another question here. Sorry, I have not read it yet, so hopefully it makes sense. So someone asks, what is the relationship between kind of this Chinese exclusion era relative to previous eras of kind of Asian coolie labor that was so important to inter-imperial labor migrations? Where then do these colonial projects find structurally cheapened labor? So kind of asking a question about how does this exclusion era relate to this broader imperial project of coolie labor that's circulating in especially the British Empire?
I'm just talking too much, but Tony Chan many years ago established that the Chinese migration to Canada was not a coolie labor. So coolies were sort of basically indentured, almost slaves who were brought in large parts in the British Empire after they abolished slavery. So we see them introduced in the Caribbean, for example, as well as in other parts of Southeast Asia. The Chinese migration was a free migration. It was done through often a credit ticket system, which was where people lend you the passage money and the head tax money, and you have to pay them back. But it's even though the supremacist discourse was that they were coolies, they were never coolies. This is not to say, however, that a large part of colonialism and imperialism was this massive movement of peoples around the world in order to facilitate their projects. Which was very much an important aspect of that I think goes undocumented. It's also a process that's going on today. The Chinese diaspora throughout Southeast Asia and the South Asian diaspora throughout different parts of the world is exactly one that's being driven by sort of forces of global capitalism and local domination.
Thanks, Tim. Anyone else want to speak to that at all?
I might just say quickly that one of the things that strikes me in terms of these different periods is the ease with which the desirability of laborers shifts, right? And so you have a moment where laborers are desired in order to help build a railway, and then that changes across a period that we're looking at. By the 1920s, the focus really is on, the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the West and settlement of agricultural laborers. And to me, there's a real resonance as we look across the decades in terms of how economics shifts the desirability of laborers. And I think that there's a vulnerability there, and I think it's one that's more widespread. We've been talking about particular communities today, but I'm just really struck by how the ease with which desirability shifts, and I think that continues into the present as well.
And maybe just to underscore something that was really an important consequence of even asking the question about coolie labor and that long system of indenture, is that it did impact, and it does impact, the histories of Chinese and South Asian people who came from the Caribbean to Canada. So that history, and from Fiji and from other parts of the globe. So we want to understand that there's a system that occurred that may have differentiated the migration stream that we're talking about here. And, Tim, I think really did a great job of also explaining how debt still carried with people, and that debt and maybe debt peonage as a system was also occurring, in which it was vis-a-vis people of your own ethnic group, but obviously of a different class, who are also controlling your destiny through debt. But the histories of indenture that really are so important and intensive in the Caribbean have, of course, a really important element of significance to people who are Canadian today, who have migration communities that have come out of that, and have and really, I think we need to sort of appreciate that it's actually through the contemporary migration we may see all these sort of legacies coming to us and being part of our lives, and that it would be helpful not to it'd be helpful to distinguish them in different ways, to see how they're different, but also to see where they come together and coalesce is also really, really significant. I think that without that, we lose what Laura and Tim were both suggesting. We need to think about the ongoing ways in which debt, constraint, control, desirability is playing itself out with migrations, and also to see our ongoing complicities in which, say, white identity isn't actually the only thing at stake here, but there are forms of control about labor and exploitation of labor that, Chinese, Korean, South Asian, Canadians, Americans are participating in, and using the immigration system to do so. That is a current living legacy. It's not just happening in the Gulf. It's not just happening in Southeast Asia. It's happening here in North America. And we have to really acknowledge that there are people that are, for childcare and for agricultural labor and the like, that are brought to North America, that are in systems of control vis-a-vis people who are maybe of their same ethnicity, but not with their same interests. And I think that's just a really important element. We have to think about what the legacies of this white supremacy is and continues, and how people participate in it through class and capital regimes that use and manipulate labor.
Thanks, Anne. So glad you brought that up. Thinking about, that 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act. I feel like even my questions today have focused mostly on racialization and race, but we've maybe less so focused on questions of class and how that shapes these systems as well. And thank you for raising that. And I hope we'll hear more about that later today from others. We have a few minutes left, and there's a couple great questions. Hopefully we'll have time for both of them, but we'll see. So the first question here is about this question of resistance and refusal. And this person asks, how do you see resistance or refusal being shaped today within academia and amongst academics, and thinking about academia itself as a white supremacist structure? How do you see resistance and refusal being played out within the university itself? Or do you at all?
The whole other panel. As
Other
somebody
panel, yeah.
who for instance was at one point an acting dean, I was inside the beast. So I think that I think it's a mixed bag, and it depends on places. There's some places that are more open than others. Just one of my thoughts, when I was doing my PhD in the late 1980s, you could count on 3 fingers the people who were interested in this research in Canada, right? And you could not have had this panel back then. It would have been simply impossible. So that's some kind of progress. Has it changed universities? No. They're medieval European feudal institutions, and they remain such to this day.
Thank you, Tim. Anyone else want to touch on that at all?
The chat questions have been amazing, and I think we're all going to carry a lot of the conversation with us as we leave. So I have a lot to say. I think we all do, and a lot of reflections and experiences with this. I'm in constant admiration of colleagues who are doing incredible work. And I think if I were to distill my thoughts, and it goes back to something that Nyan said about, and Nicole, you as well, the full complexity of individuals. And I think one of the things that is very difficult in the academy is for scholars, whether they are racialized or come from particular communities, to be seen as fully complex individuals with expertise. And you can tell I'm just skimming the surface here, but I think that there is where we see white supremacy manifest itself in many ways in the academy is the way that people's experiences and expertise are flattened. And there is something, and again, we'll talk about white supremacy a lot today, but there are so many ways in which it manifests itself. And it seems to me that flattening, that inability to see people in more than one dimension, to understand their relationships to communities, multiple communities, diverse communities, is a real challenge for the academy. And it's unfortunate that part of the work of being a scholar in the academy currently is to keep talking about these complexities and not just change we can change the academy to a certain extent, but I think part of it is being true to our scholarship, our vision of who we want to be in the academy and how we want the academy to be. So that's a quick reflection there.
Thank you, Laura. And with that, we are at time. So I want to keep the symposium on track. I don't want to be the one to blame on the first panel. So apologies if we didn't get to your question. There are going to be a lot of great panels today, so I'm sure you can ask your questions there as well. And I just want to give a big thank you to all our panelists who were incredible and generous and so kind and nodding along when I asked questions. I really appreciate that. So thank you, everyone, and stick around. I think we'll have a little interim, 10-minute break here with a video from, I believe the first one is All Our Father's Relations, which is an incredible film. But come back for panel 2, which starts at, oh no, panel 2 starts at
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock. Okay, good. 3 o'clock Eastern time and 12 o'clock.
14 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.